Israeli forces are pushing further into Rafah today, even after this weekend's airstrike sparked a major fire, killing scores of internally displaced Palestinian civilians who were living in a tent camp. Now, the Biden administration insists that Israel has not crossed its red line. Spokespeople for the State Department and National Security Council spoke out yesterday on the defensive, parsing words and sparring with the media. Let's watch.
We have made no change to our policy. We have made clear that if there was a full-scale military operation, there would be some change. But as of yet, it's not a change that we made. We do support, as we always have, their ability to go after legitimate Hamas terrorists, and that, of course, includes using American-provided weapons. But we expect them to do so in a way that minimizes civilian harm.
And then just the last question. With regard to the reports of the Israeli tanks that are in central Rafah right now. I know you said you haven't verified those reports. Has the U.S. asked Israel about those reports and an explanation for why those tanks might be in central Rafah?
We are in constant dialogue with them about their military operations and potential military operations in Rafah. I'm not going to get into any specific conversations, but we are constantly interrogating them about what they're doing and what they're planning.
Now, that was State Department spokesperson Matt Miller. Then there was the reaction from John Kirby at the White House. Let's watch.
How many more charred corpses does he have to see before the president considers a change in policy?
We don't want to see a single more innocent life taken, and I kind of take a little offense at the question. No civilian casualties is the right number of civilian casualties, and this is not something that we've turned a blind eye to, nor has it been something we've ignored or neglected to raise with our Israeli counterparts, including, Ed, this weekend as a result of this particular strike. Now, they're investigating it, so let's let them investigate it and see what they come up with.
But the president doesn't have like a personal limit to this?
The president has been very clear and very direct about what our expectations are for Israeli operations in Rafah specifically, but in Gaza writ large. We don't support, we won't support a major ground operation in Rafah.
Even the Hill's own Niall Stanage was able to get in on this line of questioning. Let's watch.
I'm not sure where you were asked by someone in the front row about condemnation of what happened in Rafah. And my transcription of what you said is, we have been, I think, very strident in our condemnation about the deaths of innocent civilians. These deaths are not excluded from that. So you do condemn what happened in Rafah?
We certainly condemn the loss of life here, but there is an investigation going on, and we want to make sure that the Israelis have a chance to do that in a fair, transparent, credible way. Look, I know what you want me to say. I get it. There should be no civilians killed. I'm not going to stand up here and make an excuse for any single individual civilian being killed. There's no excuse for it. It should not happen. Now, it does happen in war. It happens sometimes deliberately, and sometimes it happens by tragic mistake. We will find out soon what was the case here on Sunday, and then we'll go from there. But no civilian casualty should be acceptable.
And what is the administration going to do, whether it was a tragic mistake or deliberate?
Well, let's see what the investigation says.
So you're going to wait for the Israelis to investigate
Let's
themselves?
see what the investigation comes up with. If we had done this, I think we would want the benefit of having the opportunity to investigate it and to figure out what happened.
But it's not the same thing. We're giving them billions of dollars in weapons.
We're giving them the kinds of capabilities they need to defend themselves. Maybe some people have forgotten what happened on the 7th of October, but we haven't. 1,200 Israelis, innocent Israelis, slaughtered, mutilated, raped, tortured, and they're living right next to that.
The diplomatic fallout over the killing of Palestinian civilians this weekend has been swift, with widespread condemnation from France, Spain, and more. With us now to discuss all of this is The Hill's White House columnist, Niall Stanage. Great to have you in studio after participating in that interrogation of John Kirby. And you were one of many reporters asking this question. It seems to me a little bit of, shifting the goalposts that, whatever you think about what happened, it did in fact violate or at least the spirit of Joe Biden's stated red line for we're not going to support this anymore in Rafah.
Yeah, I think so. But then, I mean, there's a whole conversation we could have about this concept of the red lines and how much they matter and how much were they really intended to be red lines or not. But the spirit of the idea was there are certain things that the Israelis can't do and expect us to continue to support them. What happened in Rafah was an airstrike that, whatever intentionality you ascribe to it, killed 45 people, decapitated a child, as has been widely seen on social media, and killed a number of women and children. So, like, how does that not violate a red line? I think that's what a lot of reporters were asking.
I mean, it was interesting to see so many reporters kind of asking similar follow-up questions, trying to get at this core question of what is a red line, what does violate it, and then to see this disconnect that was happening with both Matt Miller and John Kirby. And I wanted to ask you about what you think is the source of that disconnect, because I was struck by Kirby saying there at the end, you asked him, what should happen? He says, well, there will be an investigation. You have to wait to find out if it was a mistake or not. But your question seemed to be getting to the core of regardless if it's a mistake or not, what accountability measures are going to be put in place to prevent this from happening again? Because a mistake that beheads a child versus intentionally harming a child, both are outcomes that you don't want to facilitate if you're the state that's providing the weapons that's enabling either.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. And Kirby, in trying to maneuver around the red lines question, was saying things like they haven't smashed into Rafah, or at one point cited, they haven't moved in sort of, as it were, marching in formation. I think when you have to lean into explanations like that, you're in difficulty in itself. The other point, Brie, to exactly the issue you raised about, is it on purpose, is it an accident? Firstly, there are some accidents that you just don't get to make, irrespective, and one could say the same thing about the World Central Kitchen thing, for example. 3 vehicles with humanitarian aid insignia on the roof, and they put missiles through the roof and then say, well, sorry, that was a mistake. But the other point is, not to get too deep into the legalities of it, but there's a generally understood concept of negligence, right? It's not just a binary of we go out to kill civilians or that was a mistake. If you kill 45 people, that's surely negligent by any reasonable measure.
The components of this investigation, I mean, what are they? There are now so many issues that people who are critical of Israel's conduct in Gaza want investigated or think were not appropriate and want accountability for. What evidence is there that Israel, I mean, frankly, would we trust, he brings up our own government, we would want the benefit of the doubt of an investigation. I mean, I think many progressives, many libertarians, many Republicans, if it was a Democrat, many Democrats, if it was a Republican administration, would be skeptical of the government's ability to investigate itself for alleged wrongdoing.
Yeah.
That's not even a directed at Israel in particular thing. That's kind of a general principle. So is there any reason for us to go, well, they're investigating, so good?
No, I mean, I think the perception is obviously that government investigations tend to exonerate the government involved, right? That is the broad theme of this. The other thing, though, that I would say about Israel is, like many people, even people who have followed this broad conflict closely, I'm reading back on things that have happened in previous iterations of the conflict. To make a very long story short, the leading human rights organization in Israel is a group called B'Tselem, which has investigated or scrutinized Israeli promises of investigations in recent phases of the conflict. And their view is that these promises of investigations are what they term a whitewashing mechanism, because they investigate so many cases where Palestinians have been killed primarily by members of the IDF, and virtually nobody is ever actually held accountable for it.
Yeah, Prim Tucker, who is a journalist at The Intercept, we've had him on the show before, he has one of his pinned tweets, actually, a question that he asked, I believe, Matt Miller back in April about Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old who was killed and whose kind of last words were so famously telegraphed as she was waiting for aid. That was also bombed and killed by the ambulance was also attacked by the IDF. And he also asked about some of the other instances of follow-up, including the World Central Kitchen. And the response that he got was, it's still pending. We're still waiting on follow-up. Hind was killed back in January. So I do think that there is a pattern, both recent and more historical, of Israel either delaying an investigation to a time when there's less public attention on it. That also happened with the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, American Palestinian journalist, and so many others. So it is difficult, I think, for the public to see this as anything other than a distraction tactic to try to help us wait until an outcome, and wait until a decision is made down the line when people are less focused on it, when things don't seem to matter as much, perhaps after an election season is over, and everyone forgets about the lack of accountability. To that end, I wanted to ask you specifically about the journalist from CBS who asked the question about how many charred bodies are enough, because that does seem like a sort of escalation in tone from the type that we normally see from mainstream cable news reporters.
Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting as well, because to me that was indicative of the way the public debate or the public consensus around this conflict has moved slightly. That was Ed O'Keefe from CBS News, a very good reporter working for one of the major 3 broadcast networks. It wasn't, not that there would be anything wrong with that question being asked by Al Jazeera or anybody else, but that wasn't who it was. And I think just the fact that CBS, as an example, feels that question, A, is important to ask in those terms, and B, is sort of acceptable to ask in those terms, is interesting in itself. I certainly think it was acceptable, but it's not the tone that one typically hears from major broadcasters.
And let's back up just a little bit, because there's this question about accountability, which then brings in what happens to, if it's not going to happen on the level of Israel, and it's certainly not going to happen on the level of America withholding arms to Israel, then what is the status of accountability on the national stage? So we do have both now the ICJ genocide case and the ICC prospective arrest warrants for the 2 Israeli leaders and 3 Hamas leaders as well. But you also have this news story that's emerged, and we're going to get into in more detail later in the day, about the idea that these Mossad agents have been actively threatening the former ICC prosecutor to deter her from bringing exactly these kinds of cases. How are you feeling about, or what expectation do you think there is at this stage that there will be, regardless of the judgments that may come out of the ICJ and the ICC, a change of policy in Israel?
I am not particularly optimistic about that. I do think that the Netanyahu government has come under serious criticism, including from the families of the hostages who have organised these massive marches, who believe, they've at times used terms like Netanyahu sought to torpedo previous hostage deals. So he himself, I think, is unpopular and is under criticism. And there's the whole argument or discussion that we've spoken about before, but what is the plan day after, which there's a lack of clarity about. But what I would say, and this is by no means a defence of Netanyahu, who I find an almost sort of bottomlessly cynical figure, but these kinds of abuses have been cited, including by Israeli human rights groups, for a long time, including under governments that have not been led by Benjamin Netanyahu or have not included the very, very extreme right-wing figures that we now see in governments there.
Niall, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
We'll have more Rising right after this.